English humour, a plot twist in the scripts and screenplays of English language humour. Part 16. Funny films. Well, we left the world of films with all the vaudeville actors scurrying off to Hollywood. The early comedy films, being silent, were obviously favourable to the clown-style performers, such as Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. Laurel and Hardy were there at the dawn of the age of the talkie to make their name, film swiftly becoming their chosen medium, as it was with the Marx Brothers. Another development I should mention of American film history of the 20s is the emergence of certain other stars, such as Felix, Betty Boop, and a certain Mortimer Mouse. Not flesh and blood actors, obviously, but the beginnings of an industry that would bloom into Bugs Bunny, Tom and Jerry, and the Disney franchise. Staying in the 1920s, you might be lucky enough to catch what were known as pre-code films. These were the films that were made before the code prohibiting them was either thought up or caught up with them. So these are the ones where you get lots of sexual relationships between whites and blacks, promiscuity, homosexuality, infidelity, abortion, well, real life in a word. Rather shockingly, bad characters were seen to profit, and it was probably responsible for the rise in popularity of the gangster film. On stage, meanwhile, things were getting even more lascivious. There were topless shows, lots of swearing, lots of sexually suggestive dialogue. But as these artists began to transfer to the age of the talkie, it soon became apparent that what played in New York wasn't going to play in Albuquerque. And then began a kind of cat and mouse game. Scriptwriters would use innuendo to try to get past the censors, and a lot of the dialogues were so chock full of rapid-fire, non-stop witticisms that they exhausted even the audiences. But there was where you could see Jean Harlow as the fallen woman or the man-eater. Mae West was allowed to quip suggestively to her heart's content, and become one of comedy's martyrs, as finally they got her. Tried and convicted of indecency in New York, she served 8 days in prison. And the Dragnet even managed to scoop up Betty Boop, as one disappointed critic noted. Gone was the garter, the short skirt, the décolletage. Meanwhile, in England, Will Hayes having great success in the early English talkies, where his comic character of the schoolmaster was originally a drag act. Inspired to comedy by having seen W.C. Fields juggling in Manchester, he became the star of his day. He made Gainsborough Studios a success, then left them for Ealing. During and after the war in England, we had the history of St. Trinian's, which was a satire on the idyllic Enid Blyton-type schools. But in this version, all the teachers were sadists, and all the girls were juvenile delinquents. They made 4 films, not counting much later reboots. And the odd thing about this series is it was based on a cartoon. Cartoons drawn by Ronald Searle, which were kind of based on a St. Trinian's in Scotland that he heard of whilst on holiday, just as Charles Addams sort of drew his own family life when he drew the Addams Family in America. Arthur Askey was an early music hall transition, leading the charge in making the successful transitions to films, as did Norman Wisdom, popular in England, but rather inexplicably even more popular in Albania. In Albania, he was treated as something like a rock star. This was possibly because Western films weren't allowed into the dictatorship of Enver Hoxha, with the exception of Norman's films. Because according to Hoxha, the little guy, Mr. Pitkin, which was Norman's most popular character, was ultimately victorious in his struggles against capitalism, personified by Mr. Grimsdale, thereby verifying Marx's dialectical materialist viewpoint. I have to mention Ealing, the studios in London, which, on the theme of the little guy versus the big guy, the community versus capital, followed this line with a series of comedies known as the Ealing Comedies, officially dating from Hue and Cry, which was released in 1947, to around about a decade later, taking in films such as The Ladykillers and Passport to Pimlico. Cultural norms are affecting Britain and the rest of the world. Following on the trail of Mad Magazine, we have National Lampoon branching out into the cinema. Mel Brooks made a series of highly successful parodic films. Billy Wilder, the famous film director, turned to comedy in the mid-50s. Wilder had been born in what was still known as Austro-Hungary and was a Jewish refugee from the Nazis, responsible for masterpieces like Some Like It Hot and The Apartment. All these paving the way for Jim Carrey and the Blues Brothers and, heaven help us, the Animal House series. In Great Britain, gritty realism was in vogue, and two transitions from the gritty realist stage to film met with success. Billy Liar by Keith Waterhouse, telling the story of a man who just dreams at work, and also an excellent precursor to Basil Fawlty's sarcasm. I remember, I think it was in the TV adaptation, when his mother hears Billy coming home as he slams the door and says, "Billy, if that's you, your dinner's in the fridge." To which he replies, "And if it isn't me, where is it then?" Or in the original novel, the incredibly dry line of his boss at work, who suspects Billy of stealing calendars, leaves off an interview with him with the phrase, "Well, I don't have time to deal with this now, Billy, and I don't want to spoil your weekend, so we'll leave it there till Monday morning, when I may have to consider legal action." Joe Orton was caught up in the swinging 60s. Before he was killed, unfortunately, with a hammer blow to his head by his homosexual lover, he was responsible for a series of fantastic plays, as I say, turned into films, Loot perhaps being the best example, where you get the bonus of a stellar performance by Leonard Rossiter. Joe Orton was also a jailbird. His crime was going into Islington Library, cutting things out of one book and pasting them into another, so that while leafing through a book on botany, you may be confronted with a flower with the head of a gorilla. He was going to collaborate with the Beatles before he was murdered. The excellent biopic of him, called Prick Up Your Ears, one of Joe's own word plays, starts with a policeman peering through the letterbox of the house to see what's been going on, and uttering the line, "Hello, someone's been playing silly buggers here." As of then, British comedy may have swerved a little into gentle rom-coms, unless you count Trainspotting as a comedy, which it is. Mr. Bean, of course, has had international success by not being English, by being more international, going back to the earlier silent comedy humour, universal humour, I would like to call it. So let's finish off with Chris Morris's first dip into the world of the feature film. This was a film about four inept terrorists called Four Lions, which debuted in 2010. And a marvellous collaboration, also in its starting form, not a comic but a graphic novel, called Death of Stalin, an Armando Iannucci production which stays faithful to the history as far as I can see, and ends up running a line between hilarious comedy and rather frightening tragedy. And I'll leave cinema here. It was just a little trot through. I won't have pleased everybody by any means. There'll be people out there going, "What? No Eddie Murphy, no Crocodile Dundee, no Will Ferrell, no Withnail and I." That last one is rather criminal. But this series is about English humour and not cinema. So I think, having dipped our toes into what counts for English cinema on celluloid, we'll make like one of those 1960s black and white films and go back to some gritty reality. Oh, by the way, I haven't even mentioned my favourite comedy films. Well, I have. Life of Brian, I would say, and perhaps another Monty Python one, The Knights of the Round Table. Then there's Stir Crazy, which is a feast of one-liners, with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor, and a much lesser known film called The Wrong Guy. A pastiche of just about every kind of film cliché you've ever seen.